coming at approximately 10 o'clock, but I do have a few kind of housekeeping and other sorts of things that I'd like to do. So first of all, welcome. Thanks everyone for coming today. Very much appreciate your time. This is actually our second Excellence Through Equity-Minded Teaching Symposium. We did one last April as well. And when we put that on last year, we had thought that that might be a kind of a one-time thing, but we had such good feedback from participants that we decided to do it again this year. And so I'm excited to have the second symposium. And I do want to thank a few people before we get a little bit further into the introduction. First, thanks to Stacy, who's been talking about the changing the names. But she did a lot of the work around the planning, the scheduling, the logistics, the technology, everything. So I want to thank her for her time and all of her work on this. I also want to thank the planning group, included, and I'm sure I'm going to miss a couple people, so I apologize, but Bobby Pace, Dan and Job, Raina Brown, Cheryl Calhoun, Jackie Gators Jordan, and others. For helping with the planning, but also with the screening of the proposals that individuals submitted to present here today. Also, for those of you who are presenting today in the breakout sessions, thank you for being willing to share with your colleagues across the system what you're doing to improve student success or focus on equity. It's those practical day-to-day examples that you'll be talking about that I think will be really interesting to your colleagues across the system. So thank you. And then again, one more thank you to everyone who's here today. I know it's Friday. I also know it's near the end of the semester and a lot is going on. So for you to take time today and be here, I really do appreciate that. I do want to center us really briefly. This is an equity-minded teaching symposium, so I want to just talk for a minute about equity-minded teaching. Equity-mindedness, if we take it a step back, is really about the willingness to take both personal and institutional responsibility for the success of students, but also constantly assessing one's own approach to teaching to address any patterns of inequity that might exist in student outcomes. And so that's key to this work. Many of you, if you've worked with the Center for Urban Education, or you've worked with AQ, or if you've worked with other organizations that have some focus on equity-mindedness, many of you have done and taken some of these steps already to be more equity-minded in your own teaching. But this is important because we have diverse campuses and communities. And at the same time, when we look at data, we do see persistent equity gaps across our institutions, across our disciplines. And so however, there's some promise where colleges, whether it's the entire colleges or a subset of a college, or an instructor or groups of instructors, where they have had focus on equity-minded teaching, inclusive excellence, culturally responsive pedagogy, or culturally relevant course content, we have seen equity gaps close, and at the same time, overall student success increase. So what's great about these approaches is that they don't just close equity gaps, but they also help all students in the classroom. And our board, our chancellor, our presidents, myself, and others are all committed to closing equity gaps wherever they occur. And not only just talking about it, I can sit here and talk about it, but we've actually put resources behind this initiative at the system to the tune of $5 million over a 3-year period of time. That those dollars are meant to go out to the colleges in the form of grants over that 3-year period to help institutions develop college-specific strategies, whether it be professional development or train the trainer or other types of strategies that focus on equity mindedness, inclusive excellence, et cetera, with an explicit focus in the classroom. So we're putting money towards this because where we have seen that work occur, we have seen success in closing those gaps. And so we feel like if we can have more instructors, more faculty doing this work, we can have even greater success across the system. So I want to talk a little bit about the structure for today, so that I know you've likely seen the agenda, but let me just review it really quickly. We do have a keynote who, again, will be joining us in about 10 minutes, Dr. Wood. And he will present. He wanted to have this style of format. You've probably been in some presentations where you only see the presenter, but he wanted to have this style so that he could actually see all of the people who are here. You'll be able to ask questions throughout by typing in the chat, but he'll also take questions near the end of his presentation as well. After he's done, we'll do a quick wrap up of the keynote, and then we'll break into the first concurrent session, and then break for lunch. And then there will be 2 concurrent sessions after lunch. And then at the very end, there'll be college breakout sessions. Now these are run by someone at your college, and you'll break into, so if you're at Otero, you'll break into the Otero session. And really the focus of it can be whatever you want to talk about, but what we think would be helpful is what struck you today, either from the keynote or the various breakout sessions. What did you learn, and what steps might you take as an institution? After those breakout sessions, we will not be reconvening again as a group. So when your college breakout session is done, your day is done as well. So that's the basic structure of the day. As for our sessions, you've likely read through them and made note of which ones you want to attend. Know that all the sessions will be recorded. So if you attend one and you wanted to see another one as well, you'll have that opportunity. We're recording right now, so you'll also have the opportunity to listen to the keynote again, or if you have to step out or you missed part of it, you'll be able to go back and listen to that as well. But I'm really excited about the topics that we have. There's, again, 11 of them. There's topics such as equity-minded teaching, encouraging the inclusion of students with disabilities, culturally relevant metacognition techniques. I'm really excited about that one. Chaos, trust, and love, embracing radical choice to center students in the composition classroom, and many others. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to read the session summaries and make a decision on which ones you want to participate in. Then a few announcements I want to talk through just a little bit. First of all, we have in addition to the Equity Symposium, which of course is today, we also have another event that we're working on for June, and we're calling it the Teaching Excellence Institute. This is another opportunity that will focus on teaching excellence. It's coming out of the Teaching Excellence grant from our board, but this one will be in person. Now, of course, barring any sort of change in local conditions, but our intent is for this to be in person, June 16th and 17th. It's at the Arvada Center for Performing Arts. And our keynote, we do know our keynote. It's Dr. Shakti Butler, who is well known in this space as well. So I'm excited to have her join us. We've been talking to her about not only doing a keynote, but also doing a couple of workshops with folks who are interested in that. So we'll have more details on that. Part of the Teaching Excellence grant, if your institution received a Teaching Excellence grant, you are required to present at that conference on what your grant is and what's happened so far, what's working, what isn't. But in addition, we'll be doing a call for proposals for other individuals from all across the system who want to present at this conference in June. And so more information will come. We've been focused on this particular event today, as well as a couple of other award ceremonies and other types of things going on. So pretty soon you'll start to see more information about that. But at a minimum, just keep in mind June 16th and 17th for the Teaching Excellence Institute. Our hope is that we'll be able to offer that institute each year, at least for the next couple of years, through the duration of the grant. And if it's successful, if people like it, then we'll want to continue it beyond that. But the way I look at that, and the way I look at this particular event today, is that these are opportunities for individuals across our system to share the good work that they're doing and to learn from others. I see them kind of as communities of practice where like-minded individuals are able to share and learn from each other across the system. And I know that happens individually at our campuses, but we haven't had many opportunities system-wide for people to share across colleges. And that's what I'm hoping both today and the Teaching Excellence Institute in June will do. Two other quick announcements, hopefully won't take too long. I did want to mention the Teaching Excellence Grant. I've talked about it already, of course, but the second round of the grant is underway right now. So last week, maybe the week before, time's running together, I did a session, a webinar for colleges to ask questions about applying for the grant. The grant application is not due until September, but I wanted to make everyone aware that there is an opportunity to receive dollars from the system that will go to the colleges to do work in this space. And so if you see something today that you really like, one of the sessions, or you hear something from our keynote, or sometime at the Teaching Excellence Institute, same thing, you'll hear from other grant recipients. You might say, boy, what they're doing at CCD sounds great. Wonder if we could do that at my college. Part of these two, what I'm hoping you'll hear from these two events is some ideas that you might be able to take back to your college and then apply for grant dollars that you could use to implement. Then the last item I want to mention is what I'm calling, although it's not really I don't know if I have an official name for it or not, but Teaching Excellence Fellows, specifically Active Learning Institute. We have actually one of our sessions today is on this. So if you're interested in this particular concept, Eric and Carrie from Front Range Community College are doing the session today. But we also are taking some of what they've been doing for years at Front Range Community College with their Active Learning Institute and taking that and making it available across the system. So just this week, we sent out a notice to your vice presidents and deans and SFAC and SFCC, and we're asking those individuals to forward to other faculty and instructors across the system. It's an opportunity for faculty and instructors system-wide to participate in the Active Learning Institute this fall and then again in the spring. And so we're going to have a number of cohorts over this academic year where people system-wide will be able to participate in what, at least up to this point, only Front Range Community College faculty and instructors were able to do. So I'm really excited about that. Watch for information from your vice president or dean, or if you're an SFAC or an SFCC, the curriculum committee, you likely have received the message already. Watch for that. It is an application process. You will have to apply to participate. But if you're interested in that, where the deadline, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, is April 30th to apply. We want to identify participants for the fall before the end of the spring semester, so individuals will know whether they're participating or not. I do see Eric right in the middle of my screen. If I said anything wrong, Eric, let me know. I'm assuming Carrie's on here as well. Oh, you're typing in chat. Great.
You were right on, Landon.
Okay.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I didn't have the message in front of me, but I was going off memory. Yeah, Stacy.
I did just want to let you know that Dr. Wood has joined us.
Oh, awesome. Perfect timing. Yay. Okay, well, we are going to transition over to our keynote. So I want to just take a moment of personal privilege and just say how honored I am, and I hope you all feel the same afterwards, to have Dr. J. Luke Wood here today. We're very lucky to have him. I had tried last year. It didn't quite work, but it worked this year. We were persistent and he was gracious, and I'm really excited for him to be here. If you're not familiar with Dr. Wood, he's the Vice President of Student Affairs and Campus Diversity, and also the Dean's Distinguished Professor of Education at San Diego State University. He also serves as the co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, which is a national research and practice center that partners with community colleges to support their capacity in advancing outcomes for underserved students of color. I've been fortunate enough to be able to hear Dr. Wood speak a couple of times, both times his topics, as well as his approach with the audience, which is always engaging, really left me with so many notes and thoughts and ideas about what I could do differently in my work, in my practice. And so I'm hoping you feel the same after that. Just in case you may not be familiar, Dr. Wood's research is really focused on factors affecting the success of boys and men of color in education, with a specific focus on early childhood education and community college. You may also have had the privilege to hear Dr. Wood speak, as I have, on topics such as unconscious bias in education, racial microaggressions in colleges, teaching men of color in community colleges, creating conditions that foster engagement among men of color at colleges, and many other topics. So I don't want to take any more time. So if you would join me in welcoming Dr. Luke Wood. Dr. Wood, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. It's good to see you all today. As is mentioned, my name is Luke. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I serve as Vice President for Student Affairs and Campus Diversity, and a number of other titles at San Diego State that was already mentioned by Landon. And so I truly appreciate the opportunity to be able to be here and talk with you about the work that we've been doing on culturally relevant and affirming teaching. But I have to take a slight detour before we even begin and give a big shout out to Stephanie Fuji. It is so wonderful to see you. Been a number of years, and we went together and actually did our doctoral programs at the same time at Arizona State University. So, and I've known her for a number of years in the work that she's done as a researcher and as a practitioner. And so it's good to see you very much today. So today's topic is employing culturally affirming and equity-minded teaching and learning practices to advance institutional equity. And essentially what we are going to talk about today are what are some things that we can do in the teaching and learning context to ensure that all of our students are learning, growing, developing, and being successful in the ways that we really want them to be, right? And so we're going to talk about some strategies and practices. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that necessitate the strategies and practices that we're going to talk about. And then ultimately, I also want to be able to have opportunity to hear from you. That chat window, I'll be monitoring it throughout this entire time that I'm speaking. So if there's a question popping in there, if I don't get to it immediately, we'll get back to it. I also use it for engagement as well. So it's good to be able to have that opportunity. And so here's just a little bit about me and some of the titles. I didn't put the vice president title, but I guess the other elements, what I guess is most central to here today is really my work with community colleges and serving as the co-director of the Community College Equity Assessment Lab, which is now a decade old, which is nice to see that the work has really been able to support institutions For those of you who engage in social media, these are my handles. Everything from Twitter to Instagram to Facebook to whatever I use is all the same one. So would love to engage you afterwards as well. Posing questions. I love to respond to questions throughout the week. And so in this case, the weekend. And so that's an opportunity. Whenever we begin our conversations on anything that deals with equity, we have to do so by defining what it means. And that's because you can get 10 people in the room and they can all have very different definitions about what equity means to them. And so we kind of try to center it with what it means to us. And many of you might have seen boxes outside of a baseball game. There's images of people standing on different sized boxes to connote what is equity versus equality. Or similarly with ladders underneath a tree where people are picking apples. For us, we just tried to describe it as a heightened focus on groups experiencing disproportionate impact. That's a key term that we'll come back to here in a second, in order to remediate disparities in their experiences and their outcomes. Notice that it's not a focus on remediating disparities in students, their families, or their communities, but really for us to think about what is it that the institution is doing or institutions are doing that's producing the outcome disparities that we see. And that word there, disproportionate impact, is key, because essentially what it means is that we're looking at data, right? These are data-informed discussions. It's not just about anecdote. It's not just about what sounds good or what feels good, but based upon data, when we have outcomes for certain groups that are lower than that of their peers, that's disproportionate impact. And therefore we intercede with those groups. This is very different than what many of you have may have heard before. And in fact, I would just ask it, you can slip your virtual hand up. How many of you have heard the phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats, right? As this way of trying to connote, I see hands going up, this notion that, hey, if we do good practice will lead to better outcomes for everyone. And sometimes that can be true, but when we're talking about an equity context, it can also not be true. Right before the pandemic, there was an institution that I was speaking at, and what they had been doing is for 5 years, they had been engaged in a really intentional equity effort. And basically what I did was to first begin with a celebration. I showed a slide showing that over that 5-year period, success for students had went up. Overall, if you look at the overall average, success had went up. And I was like, hey, I want to acknowledge that, because there was a lot of hard work that went into this. They did an early alert system. They did guided pathways. They did a number of other efforts in terms of acceleration around developmental education. And it really served to basically increase success for students. But then the next slide that I showed them was disaggregating that same data, but by race and gender of the students. And when I did that, what they saw is that, yes, outcomes went up for some groups. For many groups, they actually stayed stagnant. And for other groups, particularly their men of color, they actually declined during that time period. But because so many of their students were from these larger majority groups, it looked like success had went up for everyone. And the notion that this was part of an equity effort was one where, if we're having a heightened focus on these groups, and this really wasn't an equity-based initiative, this was a rising tide lifts all boats approach. And we say that approach doesn't work because not all boats, and when we think about that metaphor, boats being in the water, right? And the tide goes up and the boats lift up with it, right? It's this notion that, every boat is literally in the same condition, and so it can benefit from that tide. But in reality, not every boat is in the same condition. There are some boats that have holes in them due to systemic oppression and racism and dehumanization. There are some boats that aren't even in the water, so it doesn't really matter whether the tide goes up and down, but because they are individual students within our community who are not touched by our resources, not touched by the people, that we have these wonderful services, but they aren't actually reaching the people that they need, the tide didn't really matter. And there's some boats that are simply on fire due to issues such as food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, and employment barriers. Like, these are things that we have to think about when it comes to these issues. Now, there's lots of groups that experience disproportionate impact. It can be our students of color. It can be our former foster youth, such as myself, those who experience food and housing insecurities, students with disabilities, students who are justice involved. And then of course, there's intersections with other forms of marginality that aren't even represented here. So this is just a short snapshot of many of the groups that we know experience disproportionate impact. Now, I'm informed by the work of Dr. Estela Ben-Simon, who served as the director for the Center of Urban Education at USC for many years and retired not that long ago. And what basically she says is that we can't just look at equity, we have to have equity change the ways that we think about problems and the work that we do. And she says there's really 4 primary components to what that means. First, and before I'll answer that question that just came up. First is that we have to recognize the ways in which systemic inequities serve to disadvantage minoritized people in a range of social institutions and contexts. You can see that there's different sectors, right? And that if we recognize that there's systemic inequities in those sectors, but even more than that, an inequity in one system can serve to amplify an inequity in another system. For example, if you have an inequity in employment, let's say that you're either unemployed or you're underemployed, right? That can influence your access to healthcare or quality healthcare, right? So one system can impact another system. Another example that many of us are even far more familiar with is what is called the school to prison pipeline. And that's what I meant earlier when I talked about students being justice involved. Those who themselves have been involved in the juvenile justice system or the criminal justice system, or have parents as dependents who have been involved in those systems. And we know that the school to prison pipeline is used as a phrase to connote that inequities in education, particularly around overexposure to exclusionary discipline, suspensions and expulsion, and overplacement in special education, those 2 things serve as the 2 pillars to that school to prison pipeline. And in some ways it's marvelous. And I don't mean marvelous in a good way. I mean it actually in a bad way. It can be marvelous how you can have 2 students in the same classroom, same instructor, same social environment, same desk, same chairs, same everything, and they can have 2 wildly different experiences, and the difference being based upon some of those characteristics we mentioned earlier. And when we think about these, oftentimes what individuals do is that they try to, if you go down to the 3rd point, focus on perceived deficits of students rather than the 2nd point, which is really focusing on what are we doing or not doing that's resulting in the outcome disparities that we see. And then lastly, she says that we have to critically reflect upon our roles as educators. And we have to do the hard thing that goes beyond just critical reflection, what my colleague Frank Harris would call accountability, and accountability in an equity sense, equitable accountability, where essentially we hold one another accountable for things that we see that don't align with our institutional values. And so if we have a mission statement or a strategic plan or a set of institutional values or department values that says that we value diversity, equity, inclusion, and then we have individuals within our community who don't live up to those standards, we have a responsibility to say something and do something, because when we don't, we do so from a standpoint of privilege that our students don't have. And so it's important for us to keep that in mind. Now, I thought I would actually front load some of the comments around strategies and things that we think are important for an equity-minded class rather than saving it till the end. But I'm also then going to come back to this, but in ways that kind of provide more examples. But I wanted to just kind of go through and talk about what we believe makes a course equity-minded. And first is that equity and equity-mindedness is intentionally infused in the very outset of the course. It's reflected in the title, description, the learning outcomes, and the theoretical perspective, right? So the way in which we think about the course is done from an equity-based perspective from the beginning. Often what we find is that institutions are engaged in equitable course redesign, where they're redesigning classes that are already in place. And that is also an important strategy, but of course it would be even better if we began with equity at the front and said, what does it look like to teach statistics from an equity-minded standpoint? And I teach statistics from that standpoint. And I can tell you, it's about using data to help empower people to address problems that they face in their real life. It's about using concepts in a way that help to scaffold information and engage students in collaborative learning. It's about using culturally relevant approaches that are allowing students to see themselves within the curriculum in a way that empowers them, not disempowers them. The second is the course foregrounds the identities and lived experiences of students who have been disproportionately impacted in education. That's the cultural relevance approach, right? Where we're making sure that we're being attentive to that in the way that we think about our courses. And the course is rooted in an ethos that prioritizes community and collaboration rather than competitiveness. When we engage a class from a competitiveness and individualistic standpoint, it's important for us to recognize that when we do so, we're doing so in a way that privileges certain communities over others, rather than a community and collaboration-based approach, which is going to be more centered on what is successful and what is helpful for our minoritized students. And students and instructors both have opportunities to be teachers and learners. We believe that our students bring with them to the classroom important life experiences, and those life experiences help them to be able to convey to others the different concepts that are in a class. I would say that this is even more central in community colleges than it is in a university, right? Because students are more likely to be older, they're more likely to have dependents, they're more likely to be independents, they're more likely to have to be married, they're more likely to have life experiences that can help to better communicate some of the ideas and concepts that are coming into a class. And then we believe that there has to be a range of strategies that are used to assess student learning. The approach that we too often see is classes that have a midterm and a final, and that's the way in which the course grade is determined. That is still very commonplace across the country. When we know that if, for example, you have an early alert system and you're not alerting people until halfway through the semester because that's when your first true assessment is, then you don't actually have an early alert system. You have really an early withdrawal system or late withdrawal system because that system hasn't been able to intercede before it's too late. We believe in a range of pedagogies to address the learning and strengths of students. And we're going to talk about some different strategies for that as we get further into this conversation. That content is contextualized and taught in a way that facilitates problem solving and real world application. That they're learning information in a way that helps them to be able to go into their communities and address problems that face their communities, or to tackle real world problems that they know face their families and those that they love. And every single class that I can think of can be taught in a way that allows for that to occur. Relationship building, intrusivity, validation, and humanizing practices and race consciousness are embedded into the class. I'll conclude with some very specific strategies in terms of what that looks like. Resources that are critical to success in the course are made available to students at the outset of the course. It's very common that we see that sometimes faculty will show up to a class and their syllabus won't be done until the third, fourth week of the semester with the requirements for what those books look like and what the resources are that students need, and they're not able to be able to get those in time in order to be able to do the work that's necessary. Of course, quality of education matters. And so that's, I think, just even beyond equity, just a general quality conversation. And then course policies related to grading, attendance, participation, etc., do not disproportionately impact certain students. And so if you have a policy in your class that disproportionately impacts a certain community, then maybe it's time to rethink that policy. Now, this brings me to something that I've been wanting to talk to you about. In fact, it's been something that Frank and I were talking about in advance of this, and that's the conversation that too many institutions have about three terms: standards, rigor, and excellence. Standards, rigor, and excellence. Standards, what we expect of students; rigor, the challenge that they have in the classroom; and excellence, the combination of those two things in terms of students' ability to excel. And too often when we're talking about conversations that bring in the word equity, we immediately go to talking about standards, rigor, and excellence, because now in our minds, we're thinking about students of color. But in reality, those conversations come up less frequently, though they come up still frequently, when we're not talking about it in an equity-based context. The other critique that I would provide is this, is that we talk about standards, rigor, and excellence in terms of students, but rarely in terms of what we are bringing to the table. Are we bringing excellence? Are we challenging our own selves? Are we improving our own selves? Do we think about that rigor and that excellence and those standards in a way that only focuses on students, or do we also think about it in the ways that focuses on ourselves as educators to improve the work that we do to be the best possible educators that we can be? Now, some of you may have seen this before. In fact, I know that Landon has. This is a taxonomy that we have put together that helps us to think about how do we move forward an equity-based initiative in an institution that is committed to improving student outcomes and student success. And when we think about this, it really came from trainings that I do, and it was mentioned earlier, that I do a lot of trainings on implicit bias, microaggressions, and race lighting, right? Those are three topics that we do a lot of conversation on. And it was not uncommon, particularly before the pandemic, that I would go out to a campus to do a conversation on microaggressions. And I'd walk into a room, 30, 40 people who are there for a brown bag voluntary program. And they're, excited to be in the room. They're excited to learn more. They're excited to challenge themselves. And I would I'd be starting to set up my PowerPoint, get everything in order, with the materials I was going to pass out. And I would notice that the person putting on the event was upset or dismayed in some sort of way. And I would say to them, is everything okay? Is anything going on? And they would say, yeah, I mean, I'm glad this room is full, but when we planned this event on microaggressions, it was because of Jerry from chemistry and Susan from financial aid, because everybody knows that they're microaggressing the heck out of our students. And I would think to myself, well, I'm not surprised that Jerry and Susan aren't here because they may not care. And so part of it was recognizing that when we're in any sort of equity-based effort, we have to recognize that there's simply different people with different motivations. And we think it comes down to two different characteristics, which is knowledge and action, or knowing what to do and having a willingness to actually do it. And we know that knowledge and action don't always go hand in hand. For example, all of us know how to eat healthy, but we don't always do so. All of us know how to work out, but we don't always do so. I could go on down the line, right? So there's things that we know how to do, but we don't always put them in practice. And so you can have information, but you cannot necessarily do it. And so what we said is when you start to put those two things together, what it does is it creates a taxonomy, a way of thinking about the work that we do. And for those of you who have not seen this taxonomy before, I'd love for you to throw into the chat window, what would we call, or what could you call an educator who knows what to do and is willing to do it, is putting that action into place when it comes to equity? Just one word that you would use to describe someone who knows what to do and they're doing the work. We'll see what comes in. All right, committed, a good teacher, passionate, flexible, brave, an ally, a doer, motivated, leaders, humble. I really like that because in order to be able to do this work, you have to be humble, ethical, thoughtful, and expert. Lots of folks saying allies, reflective, caring, advocates. These are all great. And I would say, oh, wow, even more. They're just popping through. Great participation here. Professional, engaged, compassionate, vulnerable, going back to kind of that notion of humility. Well, what we call them is the choir. The choir are the ones who know the strategies and practices, and they're doing it. And I would say that all the descriptors you use are different elements about what it means to be part of that choir. And the choir are those who are going to come to a training on equity on a Friday before the weekend because they care and they're committed to the work. They know what to do. They know the strategies and practices, but they also know that knowing what to do means that they have to continue to commit to improving themselves, because you never totally know. You're never totally where you need to be when it comes to this work. We believe that equity is a lifelong journey, not an end destination. And the truth is, whenever someone says to themselves that they know everything they do, they're usually part of the problem. And they have the willingness to do it. So they're sharpening their tools. And I'll say that what we believe is that when you start out any equity-based initiative, it's actually best to start out with your choir, because you know what? They're the ones who are most likely to walk away from whatever training and development opportunities you've had and actually to put them into place. Then you have those who are the allies. These are the individuals who don't necessarily know what to do. They may not have the strategies when it comes to certain student communities, but maybe they have some things that they've learned around maybe like, hey, I know how to serve our Latinx students, but I don't necessarily know how to serve Black students well. So maybe they're choir for some groups, but they recognize that they're allies for others and they're still learning and growing and developing. But the key point here is that they have a willingness to do so. So they're willing to engage in strategies and practices that help to get them to that next step, to be where they need to be. Now, if you go to the bottom hand side of your screen, then you start to get to the groups that may not be as on board when it comes to these issues. One group are the resistors. These are individuals who they don't know what to do, but they're also unwilling to do it, right? So they don't know and they don't care. You put those two things together and we see them as resistant to the equity-based efforts. Now, we actually think that there's two different types of resistors because we've seen this before: active resistors and passive resistors. Now, active resistors will actively resist. They hear that, and these are three true examples. They hear that we're coming to speak to a campus, and the night before, they pull down all the emails of every single faculty member, staff member, and administrator, and they send them an email saying, don't go. This is an example of reverse racism and reverse discrimination. That's an active resistor. It's the individual who, when you're presenting even this taxonomy, stands up in the middle of the group and says, I'm an active resistor and I'm proud to be, because we should not be having these conversations at our institution. Or it can be the campus that you fly to and you're supposed to be doing a training with leadership, including chairs and deans and vice presidents and the president, and you're invited by a dean of equity, and you find out that 10 minutes before the event began, that the president holds a mandatory meeting of leadership to prevent them from going because they don't believe that a conversation on microaggressions belongs in their environment. Those are three true examples of things that we've experienced in doing this work. But that's not what most resistors are. Most resistors are passive resistors. They just want to stay out of the fray. They hear that there's going to be a conversation. They hear that there's going to be important strategies and tools that are presented. They're not going to say anything in public. They might say something behind the scenes, but they're going to vote with their lack of presence. They're simply not going to come. And then there are those who are defiant. These are usually individuals who are either resistors who are forced to go to mandatory training, or choir members who got burnt out and weren't really taking care of themselves. And then now they are really moved from being part of the choir to really part of the problem. And ultimately they know the strategies and practices, but they're just simply unwilling to do it. Now, when we were presenting this several years ago, there was one of the colleagues of ours was in the room. His name is Sean Whalen. And he saw this taxonomy, and after Frank and I were done presenting it, he's like, oh, hey, can I talk to you guys for a second? I'm like, yeah, absolutely. He's like, well, so I saw that taxonomy and it's really interesting, but I think you're missing a group. And once he said who he thought we were missing, we immediately recognized that there was an additional group that we weren't talking about. He said, what about the people who fall in the middle? The people who think they know what to do and really don't, or the people who think they're willing and really aren't. And what we could do is we call those individuals the oblivious. And the oblivious are really characterized by three different conditions. First, they have a savior complex. They think their job is to save, not to empower. They think they know the answer. They're not willing to listen. They bring a deficit mindset into equity work. The second are those who are non-reflective. They know the language, right? They know to say equity as opposed to equality. They know to start out a formal conversation using land acknowledgement, right? They know to say Latinx as opposed to Latino because it can be, it's more gender inclusive, right? They know the language, but if you look at what they say and what they actually do, those two things are totally removed from one another. And then the third group are those who are the grandstanders. Now, for those of you who have been engaged in doing equity work, you know, you go back 20, 30 years ago, it wasn't cool to be the equity person in the room, right? People didn't view it as a badge of honor. Your colleagues didn't, at least. It was viewed as you were disruptive. You were a person who was hurting organizational climate because you're trying to push these conversations that made people feel uncomfortable, right? But if you started to look over time, right, more and more institutions across the country have been focused on equity. And now you can make a career being the equity person. But what that's done is it's also opened up the door to individuals who don't do the work for the students or for their institution or for their community, but do it because of themselves, their career, their advancement, their ideas, their public image. And what we know about this is that when it comes to our minoritized students, they can spot inauthenticity faster than anyone else. They know when someone approaches the work with the right heart versus doing it from a standpoint that is not from that position. And someone said that this applies to individuals and to institutions. So glad you added the oblivious. I would actually say that it applies to individuals and institutions. And maybe someday when I come back, I'll present to you, we have a organizational version of this as well that has that is based upon two different characteristics, not necessarily just knowing what to do and having a willingness to do it, but thinking about what that looks like on an organizational level. And we start out with Peter Drucker's quote that culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that you can have a great strategy, right? In fact, many institutions have great plans for equity, diversity, inclusion, great strategic plans that embed equity within it. And then you look at those plans and 5 years later, nothing got done because the culture of the institution simply was preventing it from moving forward. So you have to have the culture and you have to have the strategy. And so again, there's a different way of thinking about this at the organizational level. And yes, you can also have an organization that is oblivious. So one of the things, and I'm going to go through this section a little bit faster. I wanted to talk about why we have to think about some of the practices that I'm going to offer here today. One of the reasons is that we know when it comes to our minoritized students, and in this case, let's shift just for a moment to our students of color, that they experience campuses in ways that are different than how other students experience those institutions. I'm actually going to go a step further and thinking about the work of Dr. Fuji. It also applies to how faculty and administrators are also engaged by colleagues within their own institutions as well. But racial microaggressions is a term that was coined by a Harvard psychiatrist named Chester Pierce. And he was a Black male who focused on looking at how Black people of all genders in society experience routine daily indignities, treated as being lesser than. And he wanted to think about, what does that look like? How do we describe it? Not like the over in your face thing, but this subtle, mundane, everyday racism. And that term has been taken by a scholar named Daryl Wing Sue out of Teachers College and expanded. And then since then, lots of other scholars, Daniel Solorzano, Ebony Zamani Gallagher, myself and Frank and many others have continued to expand that work, focused on people of color, and also going beyond that. There can be racial microaggressions, gender microaggressions based upon disability status, based upon being part of the LGBTIQ+ community. But this is what Daryl Wing Sue says when it comes to the racialized component of this, that racial microaggressions are brief and commonplace. That should stop us right there. They're commonplace. They're part of the daily lived experiences that people have. That brief and commonplace, daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, really pulling in that notion from Chester Pierce. Whether they're intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. Take it and leave it to an academic to give you a long definition for subtle racism, but that's what we do, right? And so it's the pervasive and racism that's normal. It's part of the daily experiences of people of color. It's the put downs, it's the subtle snubs, it's dismissive looks. And what's really interesting is that psychologists say that it can actually be more damaging at times than direct acts of racism. So as a case in point, I grew up in a wonderful community in far northern California called McLeod. I wouldn't change it for anything, but like anywhere else in the country, McLeod is not immune to racism. And the place that I grew up, it wasn't subtle racism, it was direct racism. So from the time that I was in kindergarten till the time I was around 5th or 6th grade, on a daily basis and multiple times a day, I would be called the N-word, a cottonhead, a niglet, or some other type of racial epithet that was meant to communicate to me that I was lesser than and didn't belong. But those words, when they were said to me, I knew exactly what that meant. I knew what box to put that in. I was like, okay, that's the racism box, right? I know what that means. And as a young kid, I was like, okay, well, I'm not inviting them to the birthday party, right? Because I knew what to do with that. But then as I got older, it transitioned from being more in my face and more direct to being more subtle. It was the person who looked at me and said with a sense of surprise when I would say something, oh, wow, you're so articulate. I didn't expect you to know that, right? And that's that sense of surprise that really communicated the underlying message that they didn't think that I would be. It was when I moved to Sacramento, and in 1 year, I was pulled over 10 times on the same street by police officers because they assumed that I didn't belong there and that I must be somehow be some sort of criminal, dangerous, deviant, or up to no good. It's the students who walk onto our campus at nighttime and they're constantly asked for their ID when they're just trying to go to class because it's assumed that they're there to steal something. Or similarly, that same student who then goes to the bookstore and is followed around the bookstore because, again, the assumption is they must be up here to steal something. And so that's why psychologists say that it can actually be more damaging, is because of a concept called attribution ambiguity. Love for you to type it into the chat window. Attribution ambiguity. For the psychologists in the room, you know that that refers to a sense of haziness or lack of clarity when these messages come up. So a student is in the classroom, a faculty member responds in kind of a curt way, and they're thinking, am I being too sensitive? Is it me? Is that really what happened? Or am I misunderstanding? And it's that sense of haziness that makes it harder to pinpoint what just occurred. And so like Gloria Ladson Billings and many other scholars say, what these end up doing is it ends up being a 1,000 daily cuts, like a cut and a cut and a cut and a cut. But you don't realize totally that you're getting cut. And then ultimately it builds up over time and can then be more psychologically damaging. This matters not just because microaggressions, they stay with us and they're done, but because they impact us in very meaningful ways. And this brings us to the work of Dr. William Smith from the University of Utah on a concept called racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue. And for those of you who are not familiar with Dr. Smith's work, you just got introduced to one of the most important concepts in all of psychology and education. And essentially, he started out as a conceptual framework, and now it's been validated across hundreds of studies that have looked at how when you're in an environment where there is mundane, everyday, subtle racism, even the simplest forms, that it can build up and have an effect on you in 3 ways. Cognitively, your ability to process and retain information. Think about how that affects learning. It can affect you psychologically, constant anxiety and worrying, basically an upset stomach. It can, or psychologically rather, it could constant anxiety and worrying, a loss of confidence, anger suppression, right? So things that are psychological concepts that we know are unhealthy. But the most interesting part of it to me is actually what goes beyond that, which is the physiological symptoms that happen, the physical response that your body has to an environment that's unhealthy. Tension headaches, backaches, an elevated heartbeat. I have colleagues who tell me all the time that they clench their jaws at night, or they have the inability to be able to sleep, right? There are physical symptoms that their body is having in response to an environment that's unhealthy. Now, I've seen this a lot in post-secondary education, but over the past 5 years, I've worked closely with my wife, who's also on faculty at San Diego State. She's in child and family development, IDARA. And essentially, we've been looking at what does this look like in early childhood education. And we find that even these concepts occur even at the earliest levels of schooling, preschool, kindergarten. You've got a young boy, let's say he's a Latino male, and he's in kindergarten, and he's in an environment where it's unhealthy, right? And he doesn't know how to say to his parents in the morning, my teacher doesn't make me feel a sense of belonging in the classroom. He doesn't know how to say, I'm experiencing racial microaggressions. I'd like for you to intercede, right? They don't yet have that language, but what they do know how to say to their parents in the morning when they say, get dressed and go because we're going to school, is I don't want to go to school. And then the parent turns and says, why? And they say, why? Because my stomach hurts. Because their body is having a physiological response to an environment that's unsafe and unhealthy. And psychological safety is absolutely critical in order for us to be able to ensure that students can learn, grow, develop, and be successful. And it was said in the chat window, this also aligns with trauma responses, which is not surprising. Racial trauma is very real and discussed very little. I could not agree more with that statement. Lastly, in terms of these concepts, and this is one that myself and my colleague Frank have talked about and developed, is that ultimately, when we think about explicit bias, it leads to microaggressions, and it also leads to what is called race sliding, which is that orange box in the center of your screen. For those of you who have never heard of race sliding, you probably are much more familiar with it than you realize. It's what happens when gaslighting is racial. So think about what gaslighting means, right? When someone is intentionally trying to make someone feel as if they are losing their mind, right? Like, you just said something to me. I just said that that's what you said to me. And you said, no, that's not what I said at all, right? That's an example of gaslighting. It can happen in terms of a racialized context in two different ways. First, it can be like the example that I just gave, right? Let's say that someone calls someone else the N-word, right? And you just say, did you just say the N-word? And you say, and they say, no, that's not what I said. You misheard me. You misunderstand. Why are you bringing race into this, right? And they're pushing back in a way, but you realize, you're thinking to yourself, well, maybe I didn't hear that. Maybe they said something else. Why am I putting that into this? And you start to question your own thoughts, your own recollections, your own experiences. But more often, we describe it as a process because it can be a function of an accumulation of microaggressions in an environment that lead people of color to say to themselves, maybe I'm not as smart as I thought I was. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was. Maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I'm being too sensitive. And it's that doubt, that disorientation that we refer to as race sliding, which is the process whereby people of color begin to question their own thoughts and actions due to systematically delivered racialized messages that make them second guess their own lived experiences and realities with racism. And so with that preamble of those elements of why we need these practices, we're going to shift the rest of our time to focus on what do we do to ensure that we're creating an environment that's in response to those issues that we've talked about. So now circling back to some of those concepts and recommendations that we began with, those 10 recommendations. First, what I'd like to do is to point to you to the bottom right-hand side of your screen, and you can see a model that for those of you who may have a background in student affairs or student services, you may recognize some of this model. And when you have historically seen this model, it would have had the x-axis and the y-axis and you would have had challenge and support, right? But you would have had the expectations of authentic care would not have been there. And it came from a model called challenge and support from Navit Sanford, who was a scholar who wrote in the 1960s talking about what does it take for a student to learn, grow, develop, and be successful in an educational environment. And he said it comes down to two different things. First, you have to challenge a student, rigor, right? You have to challenge them with new ideas, new concepts. You have to push them to learn new things within that zone of proximal development, right? Because you have to challenge them as much as you can so that they can learn something new. But he also said that you can't just challenge someone, you have to support them. And I like to think about support as the availability of support. A faculty member who comes to class a little bit early, stays a little bit late, sees their students on campus and makes himself open to being approached, has office hours and is there to engage students when they want to. So support is important, right? But challenge and support, according to Navit Sanford, also have to have an optimal balance between the two. For example, You can't challenge a student so much and then provide so little support. Otherwise, what happens? They become dismayed. They become frustrated. And you can't provide too much support and too little challenge, or else you're coddling them and they're not growing, right? So it has to be this optimal balance. But like most theories that were written during this time frame, they weren't written with all the different diversity of students that we have within our institutions. And so, for example, you can challenge a student all you want. You can give them new ideas, new theories, new theorems, all these different things. But if they don't believe that you believe in their ability to rise to that challenge, the challenge will go unmet. Said differently, no one has ever risen to low expectations. So you have to have high expectations and challenge. But on the bottom side with support, you can provide support all you want. You can come to class a little bit early, stay a little bit late, have office hours, make yourself open, but that support will go unused if students don't believe that you care about them personally, academically, their future. We have that concept there, authentic care. And oftentimes people ask me, well, what does authentic care mean? Well, this is what I believe. It's a shared or linked vested interest in student success, where they do well, they hit the mark, they get that grade, they get the internship they're looking for, whatever it is that their goal is, that you are going to personally feel like you did well because you're in it with them. But on the flip side, if they stumble, if they fall, if they miss the mark, they don't get the grade they're looking for, they don't get that job or internship, that you're going to personally feel like you didn't do well because you have such a shared or linked vested interest in their success. Those are important strategies that we have to keep in mind for all of our students, particularly our minoritized students. Now, we believe if you take those 10 strategies, you can really boil them down into 5 areas. And I'd love for you to use the chat window and pick one of those areas and just write it in there. Either be intrusive or be relational, be culturally relevant and affirming, be community focused, be race conscious, because these 5 practices we believe are critical to the success of all our students. And sometimes just typing these things out helps us to better remember some of the strategies and practices that we should be using to ensure that our students are being as successful as we know that they can be. So let's begin with be intrusive. So being intrusive means that we don't wait to intercede before the problem is too big. We don't wait until the building's on fire to provide support to students, right? We intercede early on. We're intrusive. We create a net of support that is so tight that students can't fall through it. Here's some of the things that you can do to be intrusive. If it's important for your class, for success in class, you know that the only students who pass your class are those that go to tutoring and meet you during office hours, then don't make it optional, make it part of the structured part of your class. Because students, when they're, particularly those from minoritized communities who may be struggling with food insecurity, housing insecurity, transportation concerns, employment barriers, access to technology issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, they see optional, they say, oh, when in comparison to all the other things I'm juggling, optional isn't high on the list, right? Because it's been communicated to them that it may not be as important as it needs to be. So you make that very clear that this is critical, that this is an expectation. The second thing you do is that first bullet point, proactively reach out to students who are in need of support. Don't wait. If you know that a student is like sitting in the front of your class virtually, I guess now, but let's just say we're in person, right? So they're sitting in the front of your class and then they're in the middle of your class, the next class session, and they're in the back of your class and they're looking dejected. Don't wait till they leave to try to intervene. Because once a student has made a decision to leave a class, it is much harder to get them to come back than it is to intervene before it's too late. We started this at my own institution after the murder of George Floyd. We saw that there were all these different things that were happening to our students, and there was so much a focus in the national news that we had our Black Resource Center, organized faculty, and we called every single Black and African-American identified student on campus to say, how are you doing? Are you okay? Do you need anything? And we heard stories of pain. We heard stories of people who had lost their jobs, those who had lost loved ones. And we immediately started transitioning those students and connecting them to our counseling services. connecting them to our career center, connecting them to resources and support because we knew that they needed it. And we learned so much from that practice that now every single week, all of our first and second year students of color get either a text message or a phone call from us, reaching out to them, sending them to services, and then doing proactive follow-up to make sure that they got what they needed. You can do that in your own classroom as well, using your learning management system or using just simply email. But there's ways to do that in a way that's systematic and is not incredibly cumbersome, but helps to intercede before it's too late. The second one I would say is to build the underground railroad. Now, this is one that really comes from this notion that not every person on our campus is going to care about students in the same ways that maybe you will. And so if you think about the Underground Railroad, right, you had those who were enslaved in the South who were escaping to the North. But in doing so, you couldn't stop at any old house along the way, right? Because if you did, you would be sent back, you would be maimed, you would be punished brutally, your family would be separated. So what did they do? They had a network of people and places that was underground all the way from the South to the North. And what would happen is that you would go to this house and then they would bring you in the nighttime to this separate location. And they would tell you to go up the river to the shack that was orange. And they would go to that shack and then they would bring you to the next place. So it was this underground network. And we have to do the same thing on our own campuses, because the ultimate goal of the Underground Railroad wasn't the Underground Railroad, it was emancipation. The ultimate goal of the Underground Railroad strategy is not the Underground Railroad strategy, but an equity-minded institution. And so what you do is you identify your person in financial aid, you identify your person in career services, you identify your person in tutoring. And you don't just say, go to those services, you bring them to somebody who you know will care about them and their success in the same ways that you will. And if you can do it in a way where you're physically walking someone over, or you're on the phone and you're connecting them on the same line, or you're on Zoom and you're connecting them and you're bringing them into the same Zoom session, even better. Many times those in student affairs have referred to this as a warm handoff, right? You have warm person who is validating and caring, and they're connecting them to another warm person who's validating and caring. And we believe that's important because of this. You can't do a warm handoff to a cold person. It has to be to someone who will care about them and their success in the same ways that you will. But we also have to be relational. Be relational recognizes that relationships are a foundational precondition to any effective learning, teaching, learning, and counseling advising practice. Let me just say this. You will not be as effective as you could be if you don't have a relationship with students. It doesn't matter how well your syllabus is put together, how carefully tailored your notes are. If you don't have a relationship with them, you simply just won't be as effective as you could be, because relationships allow students to believe in us, to trust us. And for many of our students who have been educated in environments where everything has told them that they shouldn't trust the educator, that's important. So we want to demonstrate authentic interest. And I would offer one key strategy here, which is to humanize yourself. Sometimes my colleague and Frank and I call it appropriate disclosing. And this is what appropriate disclosing looks like. It's where you talk about the challenges that you've experienced, right? Because when students see you in the front of the classroom, or for those who are in other positions, they see you in the office, what do they see? They see what they think is a finished product. Someone who is well-dressed, who's well-spoken, who has all these degrees behind their names, and they can't see a connection at all with you. That's not motivational to them. But what they don't realize is that every single one of us here have been through challenges, personally, academically, career-wise. And what we have found is that when faculty members and staff members, they say, and they talk about those experiences, that it serves as a source of motivation for students. Now, it's called appropriate disclosing because it has to be appropriate, and we mean that in two ways. First, you never want to make a statement of equivalency. For example, I would never say, hey, I know what it's like to be a woman because I'm a Black male, so this is what I went through, and so it's similar to what you went through. That would not make sense, right? That's not motivational, that's insulting. So instead, what I would do is just simply talk about what I've went through, the challenges that I've experienced, and let students take from it what they will. And what they take from it is motivation. The separate reason that we call it sometimes appropriate disclosing is because it has to be appropriate. So here's the rule of thumb. If you don't want what you shared in class to be on Instagram, Snapchat, or TikTok, then you probably shouldn't say it in that classroom setting, right? Because it has to be appropriate as well. The other thing you'll see at the bottom hand side of your screen is you got to learn at least one thing about students. And that begins with knowing their name and at least one other thing about them, right? Hey, I learned about your younger brother plays t-ball. How's the t-ball season going? It's something so simple, but it demonstrates care. And when you refer to them, you refer to them by their name. I went to a college one time we were presenting at, and there was a faculty member who responded to this notion that we should know our students' names and said, well, we have all kinds of students who are international students here, and their names are very difficult. So I don't know how you expect me to learn their names. And before I could say anything, another faculty member raised his hand and he said, what can I respond to that real quick? It's like, yeah, go ahead. Because I had my response, but I wanted to hear what this other person said. And he said, we ask students to learn all different types of information, new theories, new information, to read all these different texts and to demonstrate that learning. How can we say to students that we're not willing to learn their names when we're asking them to learn so much from us? We do so from a standpoint of privilege that our students don't have. And I was like, mic drop, I don't need to say anything else, because that is exactly what we would agree with. I'm going to go to this third one here, which is being culturally relevant and equity minded, because this is an important way of demonstrating what that looks like. One of those bullets we talked about is how do we develop a class to be culturally relevant and equity minded? Well, first it begins with understanding what it means to be culturally affirming. We are informed by Gloria Ladson Billings' work, where we're connecting content to the lives and experiences of students, and we're seeing our students as having assets in the classroom, not deficits, and we believe in what they bring to the table. But even more specifically, here's some examples of what it could look like. It means changing the classes that we teach to be more reflective of our students. Here's a title of a traditional class on public speaking. Introduction to Public Speaking. Here's an equity-focused title, an introduction to public speaking in a culturally diverse society. But it's not just about renaming the title of the course. We can go further. There is a course description for a class. This skills-based course is meant to help you become a better public speaker through theory and, most importantly, through practice, right? That is a traditional focus. Here's an equity-based focus, right? Let's go to that second sentence. Those who speak well in public and are able to engage culturally diverse audiences are typically better able to make a positive impact in their communities and to advance their careers. And so throughout the class, you can see all these different elements that are related to the diversity of focus that will be within this class. But it's not just about changing the title of the class or about changing the course description. We can go further. Here is learning objectives from a class on public speaking. The first one, I'll read the first two. To understand communication concepts that serve as a basis for effective speaking and apply this conceptual knowledge and practice to give effective speeches. And be a more analytic listener and develop the ability to analyze and evaluate presentations made by others. That's a traditional focus. Here's an equity-based focus. Understand communication concepts that serve as a basis for effective speaking in culturally diverse contexts and apply this conceptual knowledge and practice to give effective speeches to culturally diverse audiences. But it's not just about changing the title or changing the course description or changing the objectives. We can go further. Here is just an overall view of how we think about our syllabus. Some syllabi have language that is rigid and punitive. That suggests to students that the professor is unapproachable, doesn't believe in me, is not someone I should look to for support. Versus language that is caring and compassionate, says to the student that this professor is invested in me and my success, that the class is going to be a good learning experience, that I really want to make the most of this opportunity. But it's not just about changing the title, the course description, the learning objectives, or the syllabus. We can go further. Here is an example of required text from a class on public speaking. Public speaking is the title of the text, and then basically a volume that is written by some unknown person, some public speaking project. But we can then, in a traditional context, have this, but in an equity-minded context, we can have this, where we can have two books, right? The first one is that initial one. The second one is an introduction to public speaking in a diverse society. And maybe some language at the bottom that reads like this. I understand that students may have difficulty accessing the required materials, required readings for many different reasons. It happens in every course. Thus, I invite any student who is not able to access the required text to reach out to me directly so I can support you in getting access. While I'm comfortable with you sharing the reasons why you may or may not be able to access the text, you are not required to do so. But it's not just about changing the title, the course description, the learning objectives, the syllabus, or the text. We can go further. Every single aspect of our class, the assignments, the ways that we engage people in that learning environment, the ways that we validate students, can demonstrate to them that we care about them and their success. We can go further because I know that we care about equity and we care about all of our students being able to learn, grow, develop, and be successful. So we ran out of time. I could have shared some more things, but I think I hit the highlights of what I wanted to be able to express to you today. I truly, again, appreciate the invitation. And hopefully there was at least one thing that came out of today's conversation that you can say to yourself, hey, I can try that in my class. I can try that in my office. I can try that on my campus, because we can go further for student equity. Thank you.
Dr. Wood, thank you so much for that presentation. I noted, hoping you're reading the thank yous in the chats and folks clapping. Clearly, this was impressive to folks as it was to me. There were some things that I learned different from what I've seen from your sessions before, so I was really excited about it. Two questions I have for you. One is, I did see a note about your PowerPoint and whether you're willing to share that with us.
Absolutely.
Okay. So if Stacy will probably reach out to you to grab that, and then we'll send that out. The other is, it was a comment more so than a question from one of our faculty members. So we have an event in September of every year called what we call the 2-to-2. It's an opportunity for all of our faculty across their system to get together in their respective disciplines and work on curriculum related things. So we have common course numbering in Colorado. And so that requires then, of course, our faculty across colleges to work together when they write their course descriptions, their course titles, their learning outcomes, and all of those other things. And there was a comment in there that what you just went through at the end of the presentation would be a really good exercise for our 2-to-2. So I was, I'll probably reach out to you afterwards, but
Would love to do so.
I was thinking about an opportunity where either it's at the 2-to-2 or perhaps a set of workshops for disciplines who might be interested in taking a critical look at their courses across their discipline and how they could design the course outlines, which includes the outcomes and everything else, to be more equity minded. So it sounds like you've got a lot of work in that space, and that might be something that we would be very interested in doing here in Colorado.
Absolutely, would love to do so. I've also shared the PowerPoint in the chat window. I'll also follow up with it via email because I know some folks had to lock off already, and hope that it can be an important resource for anybody who wants, and looking forward to engaging further if there's an opportunity.
Right. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate your time. And I'm hoping that there can be an opportunity for us to engage in the future.
Me too. And good seeing you. And thanks for all the support over the years. And good seeing you, Stephanie. Very good to see you. And thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right, you too.
Okay.
All right, there